just want to say welcome to everybody. And I'm very delighted to introduce two of our presenters. I'm sure the other two will be along shortly. And June, I believe that we are starting with you.
That's right.
So why don't you head off into your presentation?
Well, here we are with how music's been used in death and dying. And drawing on my good friend John Taverner, the original intention of music, according to the ancients, all of them, is that it gives heart's ease. And I think that is one thing. And Taverner says, if I'm able to give 1 inch of heart's ease, that would make my life, my work, worth doing and living. So I suppose the question I ask is, how far what can music do to give heart's ease in the process of dying and the processes of life beyond dying? And this seems to me the fundamental question. Can we view dying in a new way after the pandemic? And can we add humanity to it through the medium of music? This is my overall plan. And the way that I shall move through it, just a brief survey of death and dying in our culture, and then music and dying and the development of musical thanatology and music and grieving. So in our industrialized countries, we've got people dying from degenerative illnesses when they're older, but young people dying from sudden and violent causes, and it posing a painful event in people's lives. Our life expectancy is longer. We have a range of causes of death. Death was once the property of the young, and the young died very often. Now it's mostly in old age. We are striving to decrease mortality rates in a bizarre way when you think that that's an essential part of being human. We've got an increased duration of chronic illnesses and the loss of a shared spiritual frame and associated songs with that frame. We've also got a reduction in intergenerational contact, fewer opportunities for younger people to participate in death-related experiences, and the development of life-extending medical technologies, which some would say extends the process of dying. People are dying in institutions. There's a lot of care to delay death. And then underneath it, a questioning of what does constitute life and death, raised by several papers at various points already. And families now confronted with decisions about life and death that they weren't confronted with earlier. This is compounded by the media distancing us from real life dying, and dying becoming sensationalized and violent, with a desensitization of us on the other end of a screen to the processes of dying, and a desensitization to trauma, to the real trauma of life, and so on. We have changing attitudes of secularism, or now a post-secularism. First of all, we have secularism with, in a sense, all the spiritual aspects of death and dying abandoned. But now we have post-secularism with a huge range of attitudes to death and dying, and a move and a cry from many areas into compassion. I'm at the moment finishing an article on the Oxford handbook to compassion in education. Mass media conveying numerous examples of dying and death, but distancing us from it the same way as portraying it. Dying and spirituality, we have this interface here between 3 important areas: the religious, the cultural, and the spiritual. And I've looked a lot at that in the books that I've written on music and spirituality. And we have a huge change over the course of our history. From the Middle Ages through to the 17th century, death was viewed as natural and inevitable. And then we get in the 18th and 19th century denial of the realities of death, and now a lack of first-hand familiarity with it, death becoming privatized and invisible. And in my training to be an Anglican priest, I deliberately spent 10 days working with an undertaker because I felt I knew nothing about the processes of death and dying. And I might actually, someone may say to me, "Where is my husband now?" And I would start on an elaborate view of heaven when what they wanted to ask me was his body in the hospital or at the undertaker's. I'd be asking the wrong questions. We see a rise in the study of deathbed visions by my friend Peter Fenwick. These don't appear to be dependent on religious belief or expectation. They often don't involve religious figures, although angels are sometimes present. They usually involve the presence of beloved relations whose appearance help to calm and ready the person for death. And characteristics of the experience: connectedness, unconditional love, compassion, and the impact of the vision on the dying and those around them, and the openness and acceptance of these experiences by the relatives. I did have a near-death experience which was filled with unconditional love and the presence of my parents. So in music and dying, if, as the ancient Egyptians believed that the soul is passing over in some way, they had funeral boats, and those funeral boats were carried along on song. Here we have a Celtic text on it, which I have versified and set. Give thou to me, O God, the healing power of oil. Give thou to me, O God, a place beside the healer of my soul. Give thou to me, O God, a death with joy and peace. And the last verse, of angels thou art God, bring me to dwell in peace. Of angels thou art God, preserve me from all evil magic charms. Of angels thou art God, please bathe me in thy pool. So that was designed to be sung in the room of the dying. You can see the Christian frame behind the other verses in that song. And the notion of songs to be sung in the rooms of the dying would have been part of the conventual and monastic traditions. And it would have been logical and acceptable that songs are part of dying. When the context now, we have we have a decline in religious observance, if not belief, the theology of the words for many listeners changes from a devotional meaning to a cultural meaning. And we have this interesting example that I met a self-declared atheist singing with great joy, "How great thou art," because it was simply joined him to his Welsh roots. Because music in its purest form, and if you regard the words as simply part of the music rather than as having meaning, does not offer meaning, but triggers the effect to produce meaning. So works like the Great Mahler Symphony, with its evocation of chaotic life and the finality of death, allows us to remember human sacrifices without being told what to think about them. And we see a rise in an atheist spirituality in which the useful functions of religion, of creating community and providing support, can be done by means of music and ritual without the religious or doctrinal beliefs. And so in this sense, secular music can act sacramentally in giving a sense of the divine or the cosmic without having a theological meaning attached to it. So here we have some examples of approaching death via music and so on. This is a lovely article from a new book coming out from South Africa, that if we keep people's spirituality alive, this can be done through music and enable them to approach the spirituality of dying. Here's an example of a group of people who played the piano before they went into care homes, and it enabled them to keep their spirituality and relationships alive in
Jude,
that way.
Sorry to interrupt you. We're only seeing your first slide at the moment. Are you moving the slides along?
I am. I'm moving them on, yes.
Oh dear, because we can only see, right now we can only see the first one.
I'm going to go back.
Try it again.
Yes. And I can't see you either, so that I can't find any instructions from you. I don't know. I think that's because we went into it via is that because of window?
It should have been fine because we could see it. We just couldn't see it moving, which is very odd, really. Do you want to just try it one more time?
Can you see that?
We can see it, yes, we can
What
see
are you
it.
seeing? Music
We're
of
seeing
Sacrament.
music of sacrament. Maybe you can just advance through the slides.
Shall I keep on that?
That's
I
absolutely
can't
fine.
see you, so you'll have to interrupt me with the five
Okay.
minute warning.
I will do. Okay.
Did it make sense without the scribes?
It was making sense, but it's better now that we can see the images.
Okay. And then, well, this is the one of encouraging older people who have had musical skills to carry on using them as they approach dying and death, to keep a sense of spirituality, relationship, and meaningfulness alive. And here we have Georgios Tsiris, who's a music therapist, looking at the use of music in the palliative care field. And how to support that through songwriting, improvisation, and so on. And the creation, which he was part of at St. Christopher's Hospice, of the community choir, which was helping both the people in the hospice and their relations to form relationships with one another. You see a huge choir of 80 members of patients, families, and bereaved people. And here we see the rise in the community choir movement, which that choir would be part of the interface between accuracy and uplift. So we see the reframing of the choir to being a place of uplift. Also, we see the development of musical thanatology, the notion of using the harp and the voice in the room of the dying, much like the Celtic song that I sang earlier, in which the music is being modified to reflect the passing of the person. So set up by Teresa Schroeder-Schecker, drawing on her study of the Abbey of Cluny, France in the Middle Ages, but now adapting those. Many of the chants are taken from the plain chant of that tradition. Now developed into the development of threshold choirs, starting in the States originally, and again drawing on religious practices, Hindu and Buddhist practices, and so on. My Buddhist friends, for example, would chant for a whole day in a house, and so on. But these are much more in a secularized society. But they would be using chants. And here we see the account of people who've had a threshold choir, a group of singers around their bedside, with people sometimes moving a finger. And when I've been singing at a bedside, a squeeze of a hand to know that the person is actually, as well as the gratitude of the people. A friend of mine was dying in a hospice. And when I got there, people were standing around not quite knowing what to do. She'd already told me which hymns she wanted. And together we sang very beautifully at 1 o'clock in the morning, a big family. We sang, "Give me joy in my heart, keep me praising," and "Dear Lord and Father of mankind." And we don't know how much she heard, probably most of it, but the family themselves found this was a wonderful way of communicating their love for her. And my friend Judith Silver, who founded this beautiful group called Companion Voices, and the vision she has there of bringing a loving presence and to be written into care plans. And I've written into my own care plan the notion that I want companion voices when I die. She's got a variety of groups with CDs. They practice regularly, and people feel drawn to sing at the bedside. And the nature of the companions, you can see a range of people and ages, but a gathering of friends, not about sounding like a choir of angels. There's the accuracy and the uplift, meeting one another. And the repertoire from a variety of traditions, lullabies in particular, very popular. Singing for often friends and family, but keen to offer themselves more widely. And just to get towards the end, movement and music and grieving rather than music and the process of dying. And here we have an old tradition, the sounds of lament. And that sound still, I think, present at some of the travellers' funerals, But the church has often been quite suspicious of these women's lamenting traditions, still going on, not using the keening tradition, but in the Orthodox Church in Greece, but the church being very suspicious of these women's choirs. The other way of the sounds of lament, I love Lily Boulanger, often excluded from music history, dying at 24 herself, and producing what people would say was to some extent her own requiem, in writing the requiem from her father, because she was dying at the point where she wrote this particular piece. And you see she's writing it in memory of the father, and also a memory of people in the war and so on. I'm only going to play a very little bit of it.
That's very soft. We can barely hear that, I'm afraid.
I'll move on to the next one. It's difficult to know how they're going to come across. And then the straightforward requiem. But here, a requiem by Rutter replacing the Dies Irae of the traditional text with the original psalm, which was in the requiem, which is De Profundis, out of the deep have I called to you. Here's the beginning of. Is that very soft too?
Yes, sadly it is. I don't know why, but we can't. We heard the other one, first one, fine, but
is that any better?
A little bit, yeah.
There you see the psalm coming in. Moving on to another traditional way of lamenting, the lament for the children. Is that audible? Can you hear that?
Yes, we can.
So a lament from the past being used in the present, lamenting for the children. And this, I think, is a very interesting story from South Africa. Chris van Rijn, who you see there, responding to his mother's death, sees composing as a ritualization in itself. And this, the automation of the electronic sounds giving him emotional healing. He no longer has any belief system of his own, and he describes his processes very meticulously. It's called Because I Could Not Stop for Death, which is a poem by Emily Dickinson. Can you hear that?
No, that one is very soft. We can barely hear that, I'm afraid.
Okay, we'll move on through that. And here he's writing, people have found ways to express and deal with loss symbolically. These expressions take different forms of memorialization and ritualization. The ritualization resonated with me because it implies a measure of protocol and automation that would presumably put me on a path of emotional healing. Lacking religion and finding myself a composer in a prolonged creative void, nearly 2 years passed before I was able to turn to music. The result was Because I Could Not Stop for Death, an electronic track. And he has 3 movements. Because I Could Not Stop for Death. A death blow is a life blow to some, and a bird came down the walk. In dealing with this, he found his connection with the mother goddess and the recreations and emergence of life. So death was also new life. And he saw the capacity of music to link past and present. And he reworked the notion of memorialization, a way of domesticating death and giving it a home. The role of the requiems are being sold, the recordings of them, immensely. There's a huge upsurge in buying the requiem, even though even the Roman Catholic Church has it has more questions around the belief system underneath the requiem. I remember too going to this movement, which I will play you, and I think you will be able to hear. So the Verdi Requiem, I will stop if it wants to carry on playing. The Verdi Requiem, that's the beginning of the Dies Irae, which is the poem which replaced De Profundis. The Dies Irae is a quite frightening portrayal of the day of wrath, that dreadful day when we'll all be judged, with massive drumming and so on, as you can hear. I can remember going to hear that in the Albert Hall just after my father had died. My father was a very shy man. I think he looked at life and decided not to join. Hearing that particular requiem and seeing my very timid father in the midst of this lot, I can remember thinking, I do hope that you're coping, Dad, if it really is like this. But in a recent review of grief, someone who said that she had no relationship to the theology of the Requiem, but at least that movement told her it was all right to be angry in grief. And I think that's a wonderful notion of going back to that music offers you to search for meaning, but it doesn't tell you what meaning you should have. So that the Requiem Mass is giving people a way of grieving and allowing for a variety of emotions.
About 23 minutes now, June.
Okay, so the notion that music takes us into a liminal, transformative space in which the highest human qualities of empathy, altruism, and restorative justice are there. And in my own work, I've looked at the musical experience, that if you can get the sounds right for a particular situation, what is being expressed to meet that situation, the way it is put together, and the values underneath it, we will take people into a liminal experience, which is what death and indeed birth are. And so music can play a part in that. We have this account of Dowland's Songs of Mourning showing that, and so on. So the sounds of music as serve to create that liminal space and to create that symbolic character of human worlds, which we need at that point of death. And thank you for my quick whip through musicking death and dying and the way in which music has, over a period of time, been associated in various ways. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you, June, very much. Can you unshare your screen now, and then we can
is that
open
right?
this? That's absolutely perfect.
Good.
We can open this up to any questions. I've put loads of questions in the chat, but I should give other people a chance first, really. Would anyone else like to chip in with a question or a comment? In which case, I will kick off. So, do you believe that music has always, and by always, I really do mean prehistorically always, been an intimate part of our key life moments? And is there anything you've clearly done some cognition work, and that you must have an understanding of what is it inside ourselves that responds to music in this way?
Well, we think, of course, that music was the first way in which human beings communicated before language was developed. So that's a starting point. There's also this very marvelous relationship between the natural, less organized ways of grieving. And I think that's why keening is so exciting. You know, the grief sound, you see how there's a move across from one to the other best expressed, I think, in Amadeus at the marvelous moment when his mother-in-law comes to his door and he's lying on his bed and she's going, yeah, 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 and shouting at him for what a rotten husband he's been. And then suddenly there's a quick flip to the Queen of the Night singing, which is not far off screaming, actually, in the hands of an inexperienced singer. So the relationship between the natural range of sounds of a human voice and music and the way those two interface, I think it is extremely important. And in a funny way, the music intensifies the words and takes the words deep into the heart, and so on, in a way that the spoken word, I would claim, as I would, of course I would as a musician, in the way perhaps that the spoken word, it elevates that and takes and intensifies it in some way.
Thank you. And right at the beginning, you made a reference in your talk to post-secularism, and I just wondered if you'd like to expand on that a little bit.
Well, secularism said all religious is superstitious, and to be, you can't prove it in the way that you can have evidence-based medicine. And then, of course, what happened, I think, in the UK, and I'm in particular, is we had a huge influx of believing Hindus and Buddhists. And it was quite clear that you weren't going to be able to secularize those incoming groups of people. And so you had the notion that there were a variety of religious beliefs, to go back to your first question, Richard, all of which used music in some way. So instead of having a single spiritual structure like the Christian structures that we had, even though those were diverse from Catholicism and Protestantism, you started to have a plurality of belief systems which were acceptable within post-secularism. You still had secularists that we hear on the BBC regularly dismissing experiences like one during COVID, where a person on a ventilator had a vision of Jesus holding him in a boat. And then when it came back into the Today program, they said, of course, well, I mean, these drugs do odd things, dismissing the visionary experience as a piece of rubbish. And that happens regularly. But you have got a sense that there are these belief systems and they're various now. And it's perfectly acceptable to have one that makes sense to you. What is interestingly, even about the transition from Roman Catholicism to the Anglican Church at the Reformation, is that the Protestant Church had abandoned the elaborate spiritual beliefs of Catholicism. But if we look at the book on the stripping of the altars, which says what remained of Catholicism for a very long time, it was 200 years of people, even with Anglicanism as the dominant faith, going out to the graves with candles and singing. So it was the rituals around death and dying that were persistent, that people needed those rituals. And to a certain extent, Protestantism got rid of those rituals. So it shows how important those rituals were and still are.
Mark, you had a point about the breath leaving the body. I just wondered if you wanted to come in with that.
Yes, is my sound on now?
Yes.
Wonderful. Yeah, I think you made an excellent point about something which may be as much physiological as spiritual or cultural, that the sounds of keening and the sounds of lamentation, which go very deep, because at the level of human physiology, the breath leaving the body is half of what we do all our life. It's most of singing, and it's the most obvious physiological symptom for death, the breath leaving the body.
That's right.
And the resonances between those things are absolutely acute. I mean, I'm sure you're well aware that the oldest full pieces of music we have are things like the Hurrian hymn and the Psycholos hymn, which are laments. Yeah?
That's right.
I suspect, as you said, that, I mean, I've seen magpies mourning the dead. I suspect that the keening sounds, the mourning sounds, the outpourings of grief predate the human by probably hundreds of thousands, perhaps even millions of years.
I'm very interested in what you're saying, because now that I'm much closer to nature and I'm starting to join in with the birds and things to respond with them with their own sounds, I'm beginning to hear their language much more clearly. Yeah. And I do hear the laments. I can hear the lament, and I'm aware of the lamenting sounds around. At night time, I hear them. You know, I have my window open onto the garden and I hear the laments going on. And in fact, the church, in many ways, and remember I am an Anglican priest, has lost the sense of lamenting.
Yes.
It's a real... I've just did a project about 4 weeks ago, which was people with disabilities, setting the psalm out of the depths of I cried to you, O Lord. And we've got 21 pieces, which people who didn't think they could write words or music have. And I want to see if we can get that lamenting back into the churches. Well, the church has got into knowing when really it should be into not knowing. It should be into mystery and so on. And we've made religion, we've twisted it round into knowing when it should be about not knowing. And so the lament for things that, for the uncertainty of life, for the loss of life, we ought to have that in the churches. And, you know, it's but one bit where the churches, I mean, I am a priest, but it's got it badly wrong. And I can say that from the inside. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Gina. It actually gives us a perfect segue into Mark, who's going to do the next segment in this session. Very much appreciate your contribution, and there's some nice comments in the chat, and that was great. Thank you very much. So, Mark, I'm going to hand over to you now.
Could I, if it's okay with everybody else, defer my spot until Helen's done hers, because Elisabeth, my co-conspirator, is in a terrible example of life and art getting closer together than I would like them to be. She's just been in hospital with her father, who's got very severe breathing difficulties. So she's racing back for the ferry to mainland Sweden now, in the hope that she can co-present with me within the next 15 or 20 minutes, I hope. If not, I'll wing it myself.
Okay. Helen, are you happy with that? You need to unmute yourself.
Yeah. So my presentation, because I have had these kind of problems before, my presentation is a film that I've made. I'm sitting in the same chair with the same dress on. So it'll just be like me talking. And the presentation is 27 minutes long. So if I see a lot of questions in the chat, I may cut it a bit short. So I'll just try and play it by ear.
Okay.
Across the world, ceremony and ritual are central to the way in which we engage with death. The requiem, though originating in the Catholic Church, continues to develop in the hands of composers and other artists, becoming increasingly abstracted, secularized, and universally accessible. My name is Helen Ottaway. I'm a composer and sound artist who over the years has repeatedly found herself working alongside other art forms, particularly theatre, dance, performance art and visual art, and collaborating with other artists. These interactions with other disciplines and my 2 encounters with composer and thinker John Cage have influenced the way I plan, compose and place my music. I rarely think in terms of pure music for the concert hall. I think of my music as site-specific or site-responsive. It's important to me where the sounds and music have come from and what their relationship is to their environment. My mother died a few years ago. I'm a certain age. This is happening to my friends too. We're becoming orphans. We are now the older generation. What happens next? Do I go on just the same? Does this change me as a person or as an artist? Does my new situation even have anything to do with my artistic practice? Well, actually, yes, it seems that it does. My working life experienced a long pause while I looked after my mother in her final years. I don't begrudge it. I valued the time we spent together, even when she was quite ill. When she died in March 2017, I experienced grief and I missed her. But her death also released me back into my working practice. And I was finally able to accept the opportunity offered twice before to take part in the Suramadura International Artist Residency. The residency took place in Sri Lanka, where on Boxing Day in 2004, the people suffered catastrophic losses as a result of the Indian Ocean tsunami. With my recent personal bereavement as well, I decided that my residency would focus on loss, absence, and memory. My idea was to start to write a new kind of requiem, a site-specific work combining live choral music and sound installation and outdoor performance. My aim while in Sri Lanka was to create sketches and miniatures, pieces which can stand alone but also be the starting point for the larger work I was planning. I knew there'd be no piano where we were staying, and that I would have to find other ways of writing music. Several years ago, I had bought on a whim a musical box mechanism, the kind that plays by winding a strip of punched paper through it. I decided on the basis of its simplicity and its size that this would be my ideal travelling composing machine, and so I packed it, along with my handheld recorder, a couple of hydrophones, and some tiny battery-powered loudspeakers. I spent my time in Sri Lanka talking to local people and recording their memories of the tsunami, making field recordings of nearby locations and nature, and punching paper strips to make tunes for my musical box. I found the activity of sitting and punching patterns of holes in paper strips gave me time to think and reflect, to absorb my surroundings, and mostly just to be with the sea and the endless and enveloping sound of the waves. It became clear that this little musical box would hardly be heard above the sound of the waves unless it had a soundboard and a box. So I commissioned a long box with soundboard for the mechanism from Nalinda, the wood carver across the road, and the result was a beautiful mahogany musical box. This is the musical box that I brought back from Sri Lanka, but a couple of months ago it had to undergo major surgery. The mechanism had started to stutter and stick, so reluctantly I had to let it go. A while ago I'd been told by a French musical box manufacturer that my original was cheap and basic and might not last. This being the little device that travelled to Sri Lanka with me and played my first pieces, I was very sad to say goodbye. The same Frenchman had supplied me with a superior model, so my partner Steve and I set to fitting the new mechanism. This involved a certain amount of sawing and drilling and making the new part fit, so I'd like to thank Steve for being surgeon. The new musical box is smoother and has much less of the roughness of the original. During this talk, I'll play you the 5 tunes I wrote in Sri Lanka and tell you a bit about them. I gave them the collective title of Wave Songs. The first one I made, I did at the bottom a kind of wave pattern to reflect the sea, and then over the top I put fragments of a tune that my mother loved, Blow the Wind Southerly. So this first piece sounds like this. The second of the pieces that I wrote was inspired by fishermen that I saw pulling their nets out of the sea. They were singing a song as they hauled, and although I didn't hear much of it, I heard just enough to base this second wave song on that tune. As you can see, this is quite a visual form. And so for my third piece, I decided that I would try to create waves on the paper strip. So I drew the waves on first, and then I punched as much of the line as I could, so that you get the pattern of the waves visually. And I think it does slightly sound like waves rising and crashing. Another piece of work I made during my residency was a performance I called Drawing in the Sand. I was looking for a way of illustrating the transient nature of life and also of sound. At the same time, I wanted to reflect something of the human instinct to survive and the drive to keep going in difficult times. This sense of keeping going was especially noticeable on the southwest coast of Sri Lanka, where the people have no real alternative to living on the coast, but who live with the constant fear of another tsunami. My performance consisted of drawing musical staves in the sand with a rake that I had customised, and then with a branch sharpened to a pencil-like point, I attempted to write a tune before the waves washed over and erased it. In the autumn, on that beach, the tide hardly moves and is always very close to the shore, leaving only a short expanse of sand exposed. Once or twice I managed to write a whole tune. Once or twice I managed to write a whole line of my tune, but it was never very long before it was washed away. I enjoyed stepping outside my usual practice to perform this durational piece. It seemed like an important thing to do, to introduce new ways of working, particularly this physical performance with the element of endurance. Both the hole punching and the sand drawing were new kinds of activities for me. One of the great gifts of the residency was time. The musical box tunes and the sand drawing are examples of me finding new ways of using time in the production and performance of my work. I found myself surrounded by lines. I was drawing lines in the sand, but also there was the line of the sea, the line of the road, the line of the hotel corridor, the line of the road to the jungle, the line of the railway tracks. And so this fourth tune, which I called Drawing Lines, it's a kind of minimalist piece, but based on different lines layering up over each other. I mentioned the sound of the waves earlier. We were staying in Hikkaduwa, in a hotel wedged between the sea and the main southwest coast road from Colombo to Gaul. The sound of the waves was very loud and constant. No gentle lapping, but the full force of the crashing surf. On the other side, the road with its careering buses and tooting tuk-tuks was equally noisy and almost equally constant. Beyond the road, in the jungle, you were surrounded by another rich sound world. Birds squawking, monkeys calling, dogs barking, trains hooting, and still more tuk-tuks tooting. The most peaceful place I experienced was the inland lagoon, calm waters gently stirred by the oars of our boat. I wanted to capture the clash of sound worlds that was my constant companion, and so I made a sound installation to be placed in the corridor which linked the sea and the road. This way, the sound installation was partly an enhancement of the real sound. In that first demonstration, I wanted it to be hard to tell what was real and what wasn't. I overlaid the environmental sounds with snatches of interviews with local people and fellow artists, stories of loss and survival, with water and the sea a continuing theme. The sea soundscape featured the voice of fellow artist Kina Hodges, who talks about being at the beach when she heard that someone very close to her had died. The opposing soundscape features extracts from an interview I conducted with the assistant manager of the Tsunami Museum in Paralia. She tells of her flight inland away from the tsunami with her 2 children. The sound of water pervades both soundscapes. Other sounds, bells, traffic horns, and fragments of the music I'd been writing during the residency, drift in and out. I placed my tiny loudspeakers one either end of the corridor, facing each other. The effect was an immersive enhancement of the existing aural environment, a feeling of being submerged in a heightened and narrated version of the sound world of the sea, road, and jungle. The piece will never have exactly the same effect as when placed in the original location, with the confusion between reality and artifice, but I've been very interested in how it sounded in different situations. At the end of my time in Sri Lanka, I had the opportunity to install the piece as part of the first International Human Rights Festival in Colombo. It was placed in a staircase between 2 galleries, with one speaker at the bottom and the other at the top. As people walked from one floor to the other, they passed through the uprooted sound world of Hikkaduwa and were temporarily immersed. Since I've been back in the UK, I've also given demonstrations in offices, houses, barns and galleries. Each location lends the piece a different feel, making it as much about each new place as where I was when I created it. The corridor inspired the final of my 5 wave songs. So this piece was written for myself and 2 of my fellow artists to sing in the corridor, and we did sing it, but this is the musical box version of the song. Much of my previous work has been created in response to a sense of place, urban and rural landscapes, buildings and bodies of water. Themes of loss and memory have also appeared repeatedly, and strangely, I've only just recently realised that this was the case. For the most part, my references to loss and grief have been remote, second-hand, historical, or based in mythology. Art Music's Thin Air, designed with Alistair Goulden for large religious spaces, is a sound sculpture which brings the building and its inhabitants, past and present, to life through sound. Our sound installation Lacrimae reimagines the story of Phaeton's sisters lamenting and weeping for their lost brother. The Opera Room memorialised the tradition of summer opera making at Shawford Mill over several decades, and the year-long project In the Field was created to mark the centenary of a particular battle in the First World War, where 25 young men from Wadhurst lost their lives in one morning. Even back in the 1990s, working with the group 3 or 4 composers, we were making work inspired by the disappearance under the sea of the bells of 55 churches in Dunwich on the Suffolk coast. The work I did in Sri Lanka was the first time I chose to develop musical and performance ideas in response to the life and death of a real person close to me. Since my mother died, now more than 4 years ago, I have lost friends and colleagues too, and so hints of these others are now seeping into the work. A new, much longer piece for musical box and voice, written in 2019, includes reference to an old friend who died the Christmas before. That piece, called Wind and Unwind, was commissioned by Activate Performing Arts and Inside Out Dorset Festival to be performed under the moon in Luke Jerram's Museum of the Moon, which in the summer of 2019 was installed in Sherborne Abbey. I devised a musical box score that was 15 metres in length, combined with a setting for voice of Thomas Hardy's grief and guilt-ridden poem In the Moonlight. As the paper strip played out through the machine, it unrolled down the aisle, reaching nearly from the crossing to the back of the nave. I thought of it as a life unwinding through music and song, or the shadow of a moonbeam reflected across the floor. The same year, I was invited to deliver this talk at the 14th International Conference of the Social Context of Death, Dying and Disposal at Bath University. It was a real gathering of academics and practitioners, all of whom had a different perspective or a different approach to death. I learnt to study and draw a skull. I listened to renowned forensic anthropologist Sue Black talking about her work deciphering the aftermath of the war in Kosovo. One of the most fascinating of the people I met was Karen Krolak, a choreographer from Boston, who, as a result of losing her 3 closest family members in a road accident, started to assemble the Dictionary of Negative Space. She had noticed that very often, and when you most need them, the words for what you're experiencing while grieving for loved ones simply do not exist. Her dictionary is full of absence. Numbers stand in for words we need but do not have. We have some, widow, orphan, but where are the words for someone who has lost a child or a sibling? Those and hundreds of other words are missing. Numbers representing missing words are cross-referenced with other numbers standing in for more nameless feelings and experiences. Talking to Karen and reading her dictionary led me to realise that I too had been dealing with negative space, making holes in the paper strips to play through the musical box. I was creating absences, notating losses. The sketches, the installation, the performance on the beach, wind and unwind, these are all points on the way to my new kind of requiem. I'm about to embark on the next stage, which involves collaborating with poet Rosie Jackson. My work on this project so far has been unusually solitary. I did have the help and support of fellow artists on the residency in Sri Lanka, but most of what I've done alone. I am naturally a collaborator, and although this solo period has been illuminating and empowering, I'm really looking forward to working with another artist on the next stage. I think of this work as a journey, both in the writing and the eventual performance. The route and the destination are gradually becoming clearer. The process seems quite different from the usual business of writing music, and just like grief, it seems to take its time. This is the 7th time I've given this talk over a period of 4 years, and it too is growing and changing. As I've described, the death of my mother was a major catalyst for new work. Personal bereavement is, I think, a common trigger for a requiem. I always thought of what I was doing as having a wider, more universal theme too, hence the focus on the impact of the Indian Ocean tsunami. However, in the 4 years since I first delivered this talk, I feel we're being overwhelmed with other kinds of loss. Environmental loss, loss of species, erosion of human rights and democracy. These losses somehow dwarf our personal losses. I don't really know how to address this in my creative work, but I have faith in the process and hope that when the new kind of requiem is created, and hopefully I'll also think of a new way of describing it, it will be relevant and meaningful. I'd like to finish by playing one of my 5 musical box pieces again, in a different way. It's one of the unforeseen consequences of this way of writing music, punching holes in strips of paper, that you end up with 4 different ways to perform each piece: forwards, backwards, upside down, and both backwards and upside down at the same time. I always really enjoy the accidental in art, and it's a happy event when something unpredicted appears. So here is the corridor song played backwards and upside down.
Thank you very much. That was very nice. I'm glad we managed to recapture it once we lost Elisabeth. However, once we lost Helen. It's perfect timing. However, Elisabeth has managed to get in, and so she and Mark can kick off.
Hello. Can you hear me?
We can hear you. Yeah.
Wonderful. Wonderful. I'd like to commend Elisabeth's courage for being here. She's just raced back from a visit to her father who's in hospital. So things are a bit fraught, but our methods are unusual at the best of times, and we're used to embracing all sorts of chaos. I was very interested in what Helen was saying about her openness to accident in the work. It's one of the things which several years ago I was interested in was a practice in electronic music known as circuit bending, where you sort of open up an old electronic musical instrument and poke the corners and cross the wires and simply see what noise it makes. And I found it was a wonderful way of letting matter speak for itself, that matter is not inert. Even if you don't poke it, it has its resistances and potentials which are capable of making music. And one of the things that Elisabeth and I have been doing is developing a musical method that she made me aware of from Renaissance musicology called ornamentation. She can talk about that in much more detail and clarity than I can. But the idea that matter is dead and cannot speak for itself is pervasive and I think quite damaging. I mean, so much so that even a so-called critical philosopher like the great Immanuel Kant at one point came up with the statement that the notion of living matter is a priori impossible. The metaphysical split that we see between matter and spirit, which was certainly with the Neoplatonists and perhaps Plato and Pythagoras in relation to music, was firmly enshrined by the Council of Nicaea. And I see it as a fatality, the idea that matter is incapable of speech and matter is just dead stuff. So in a fairly random and surreal way, I want to start with a nursery rhyme, an Old English nursery rhyme, which for years I thought was just a nonsense rhyme. Perhaps it may be, and I'm overinterpreting it. But I see it in some ways as a history of the journey between Jesus the storyteller and the imperial Leonine and Aquiline sort of tyranny of the Catholic Church, and the way in which death is doubled from a material sacred event into a metaphysical, both physical and spiritual event. The rhyme goes, "There was a man of double deed who sowed his garden full of seed. When the seed began to grow, 'twas like a garden full of snow. When the snow began to melt, 'twas like a ship without a belt. When the ship began to sail, 'twas like a bird without a tail. When the bird began to fly, 'twas like an eagle in the sky. When the sky began to roar, 'twas like a lion at the door. When the door began to crack, 'twas like a stick across my back. When my back began to bleed, 'twas death and death and death indeed."
we try to between one note and another.
Hello. The sound is glitching terribly here.
So maybe you go on, Mark. Can you? We had in mind. We were doing an experiment.
Elisabeth, I don't know if you can hear me clearly, but we've had a few problems with the sound where people's microphones sound like there's a loose connection. If you nip out the room and nip back in again, it sometimes heals itself.
Good. Will it? Mark, can you hear me at all?
I can hear you, but it's very, very crackly. How's your sound, Richard?
Not good, I'm afraid. I'm afraid Elizabeth's connection is bad, which is a shame because the singing was beautiful and it was being rather badly broken up, which is a shame.
Okay, I shall press on, and if anyone could message Elisabeth with any kind of suggestions as to how we might iron out the broken biscuit sounds, then I'd be very grateful. Yes, the ornamentation technique, which Elisabeth will be able to speak about far more clearly than I, comes from Renaissance musicology, and the basic method, as I understand it, is to begin with any two notes and to simply repeat and develop them and allow the sound itself, the breathing itself, to develop its own differences.
I mean, now again, can you hear me better now?
That's much better, yes. Yes, okay. Brilliant.
So
would you like to take over with an explanation of the ornamentation method in Renaissance vocalization?
Yes. So what I was doing now was basically what we have been working, the method we work on, which is encountering. It's basically encountering the unknown, and when singing, well, really the question starts with what happens between two notes, what happens between 2 points, what we don't see in the musical score, which is then developed to actually link any two things or more. So what happens between 2 points, between two beings, between two letters. So we had in mind now when we started not to kind of introduce ourselves, but basically really to encounter you all, but through Mark reading the rhyme and me encountering with the sound and then responding again. It's basically to put yourself into what you don't know. And ornamentation in early modern period was to overspill and to touch. Touch and overspilling was basically the keys. And what would become out of an ornament, one would never know. But it aimed to move into the heart and the soul of the one who would listen. So this is like jazz music, or you don't know what will come out of a solo or an encounter between people, but you will only know when you are doing it. So we work on this also with texts, with sounds, with images, and what we will propose to you for this night is also an encounter with what we have encountered, but also allowing you all to kind of encounter our exposition during the night vigil. So I think we should kind of explain that a little bit more, Mark.
Thank you.
We could have done more on this if my microphone would have worked better, but my response to the poem of Mark would be something that I don't know, but it would come out in sound. And then Mark would encounter that and bring it somewhere else. And you can go on with that forever and ever, and you can spill over into any type of ornaments. So
I think one of the things which is central to our research is a certain type of deliberate abandonment of mastery. The idea that one knows what one is doing is sets too many preconditions on the process. And the title of our major ongoing piece is No Self Can Tell. And this is what links it to death, is the idea that a certain type of ego death, a certain type of willful abrasion or even destruction of the self is creatively useful. It makes space for something else. And with Elisabeth batting out of a deeply Christian tradition, I've had a greater understanding of how this makes sense to Christians in terms of the concept of grace. That one has to step aside and let other things happen, that other forces are at work which are non-egoic. And this is unplanned. This is something I heard on the radio just not very long ago at all, that our glorious leader, Prince Charles, was talking at the Glasgow summit, and his speech was about the cost of climate change and planetary extinction and so on and so forth, and how world leaders should approach this as if they were on a war footing. This language of domination and control is, I suspect, metaphors are not innocent, as much part of the problem as it ever could be a solution. And allowing oneself not to be in charge of a process, allowing trusting in the otherness of both other people and materiality to do much of the creative heavy lifting is quite ecstatic. It's quite ecstatic. The vigil is a peculiar form. It's usually associated with either political protest or religious dogmatic devotion. I think what appealed to me about the vigil form is something paradoxical and perhaps slightly perverse, which some of you might know from the music producer Mark Hammett, who is perhaps best known for his work with Joy Division and New Order, who when people were recording, he would say infuriating things to the drummer like, no, that's rubbish, stop that. I want you to do it faster but slower. And in jamming the usual logical or theoretical material, he could often coax or provoke much better performances out of people than they would otherwise give. I mean, as was said before about collaboration, collaboration pushes people into zones they wouldn't otherwise go. And much as I admire academic rigor, precision, clarity of expression, the idea of an all-night vigil allows things to happen in that sort of different space, different time, which is both faster and slower than the presentation of information about death. Because I genuinely believe that, with all due respect to the deeply religious people present, nobody, not the Dalai Lama, not the best Bible exegete, knows a thing about what happens after death. It's to me, it sounds like a cactus trying to tell me about swimming lessons. It is a huge limit to human knowledge, and the embracing of non-knowledge, the openness to the finitude of our own cognitive abilities is something which doesn't necessarily thwart us. And the methods that Elisabeth and I have been exploring are, I suppose, more than anything else, ways of approaching this limit of non-knowledge obliquely.
Yeah, and I think what I could add to that, when we wanted to start this session, it's common to kind of introduce yourself, who you are, and put your titles. Really embedded in this method of encountering, it's not to place oneself with a title or a bio, but it's basically to just meet from zero, from nothing, which is full. Embedded in nothing, there is everything, but we don't know about it until we actually step into it. So I'm often thinking about not interacting with something, but intra-acting, that I'm already not embraced, but I'm already inside something that I don't know what it is. So in encountering death, and the first image that comes to my mind is sitting next to somebody who is dying, and just encountering the hand with somebody at a deathbed, and allowing everything else than the actual touch to talk to you, and the closeness of that experience. So that is an interaction, and I think sometimes we talk about things and we place ourselves at a distance, but instead in this work we are trying to. We come from different places. We come from different. We have never met. I mean, me and Mark, we have actually never met, but we created a work during 2 years where we were open enough to encounter what will come. And often when we start, it it never ends. But it's difficult to cut because it never ends. It goes on. We can step in and out of this room, and we can, and then when we come back, it's always ongoing. So that is what we have in mind to show you. And I think we also would like whoever wants to come in and add to this exposition. I don't know how to, Mark. Should we have 10 minutes more? Should we kind of introduce what we are proposing tonight?
Just before we do, very, very briefly, because I'm aware that time is always a factor, isn't it? To pick up on something that June said earlier on, about 45 minutes ago, and something that Bio said in his keynote speech yesterday, we've become catastrophically defamiliarized to death. I mean, I know people of my age who've never held the hand of a dying person, never been to a wake. If they've seen dead people, it's been on pixelated screens. I think it was Philip Iries in his book, The Hour of Our Death, who was pointing this out in the closing pages of his book in the 1980s. And I think it's only got worse since then in the Western world, that death has become a kind of medicalized, compartmentalized, dirty secret. And that is much to the detriment of human experience all around. Bio's point was he was saying that the important things always happen at crossroads. Crossroads are fateful places. It's where two particles interact in physics. You smash them together, and that's when you discover stuff. But you don't know what's going to happen ahead of the impact. Crossroads are, where Robert Johnson sells his soul to the devil, and a new form of music is born. Where suicides are buried. There are thin places. Well, we're on Halloween. There are places between worlds. And Elisabeth. And my practice over the last 18 months, 2 years, has particularly been an interaction between my, certainly not reductive materialism, but I just like to label it, but something like a sort of a filthy, expansive pagan materialism, and her profound Christianity. And the interactions of those things have strangely not been in any way hostile. I think they've been, I think one of the things which is perhaps worth saying about and developing in our method is it's utilized a musicological method in a way which we think is actually very practically applicable to interfaith dialogues, or interfaith and no-faith dialogues. I thought I'd better get that in, and then Elisabeth, if you want to explain the setup of the vigil and how we don't expect everybody to be there for all the time.
No.
It's free to drop in, and all are welcome at any point. So if Elisabeth, if you want to explain the mechanics of it a little.
Well, I'm thinking I'm going to put a website. I don't really know how to share the screen here now, and I don't know how it works really with the sound, because the website is that you're going to get a link to is a lounge, the vigil lounge, where which is going to be open. It's open already now. It has a sound in it, so if I put it here, it's going to sound, and that will interfere with what we're doing now. But you click on that, and you come into a room, a space, which is a vigil lounge. Every hour from 10 o'clock your time in England and 11 o'clock my time. There's a link. Yes, good, Richard. Every hour there will be one room opening throughout the night. 9 rooms are waiting for you. When they have been opened, they will not be closed. So if you would like in a week time, you can go back and visit. But they're opening slowly. And these are spaces which have been started by our dialogue. And what is coming out is both sound, images, and words. And in the best way, it's also open for anybody to add to this. You can contact us and we will add in thoughts that comes to you. After 40 minutes into the hour, we will be available here in this space again, or maybe it's in the main area. Mark, you know this better than me, but we will be available here all through the night for 20 minutes before every hour, so 22:40, 23:40, to talk if anybody wants to talk. So this is the idea. 9 rooms are waiting. And it's about ornamenting the shadows of death and life. It's it's an interaction that is ongoing. Mark?
We especially welcome comments, criticism, however abrasive, from contrary voices or interjections. There is a sense that we genuinely do not have any egoic, especially no brittle academic egoic sort of investment in this project. It's something much more open than that, and neither of us have any interest in being right. Far from it. I think we've come to a kind of agreement on the topic of both death and mysticism, that the idea of there being an answer, let alone a univocal correct answer, is a vanity. I'm really happy to field any questions now about methods, procedures, so on and so forth, if anyone has any.
I think at the moment we will find that people are, your process sounds so wonderfully organic and exploratory that I'm hoping people will more people will come and join you tonight to discover that process, because it sounds like a musical improvisation. It sounds gloriously exploratory in that sense, and this idea of kind of ornamenting between space is such a rich idea, such a lovely idea. So I look forward to coming into a bit of it myself.
I could just add that if anybody has a trouble to get into the expo tonight, they can email me. Is my email available there directly on the website, or should I just add it here also, Richard?
I think the best thing, Elizabeth, would be to add it here, because although you can contact people directly and hop in, it's not an email contact. So
no. So I just write it here and.
Great.
If there is any trouble
Great.
of getting
Thank you, Elizabeth. Yeah. I say it should be a very straightforward link, just straight from coming in from the hop-in session. So,
Can I come in on this, Richard?
Of course you can. Yeah, please do.
Because I've been running during COVID, we've been running an improvising choir over Zoom, where people can bring in anything they like, and we have periods of silence, and we do 6 or 7 hours, because we often do it around this time, Samhain, when it's the remembrance time. We also do it around Holocaust Memorial Day, and so on. And we've had people from 4 continents. There's been marvelous bits of more Arabic sounds coming in when they're in, and then it shifts across to more English sounds, and then across to more American sounds. Because really, people can bring in whatever they like. There are some shared chants which people can learn, which we sing together at some times. But and it's based on, we've been basing it on a drone, and so on. But sometimes there are periods of silence. I'd always imagined, because I've been running a peace choir in Winchester Cathedral of that kind for 10 years, and I'd always hoped we could have it all night. But it's very difficult to have the building all night. But you may know, Mark, John Taverner's work, The Veil of the Temple, which is an all-night vigil, which was written for Temple Church. So the notion of a improvising group, I did it basically, as you say, a peace choir. So in the cathedral, we had Muslims, Jews, Buddhists, children, humanists, all together. And they chose in advance what they would like to sing. And then in the middle, for 1.5 hours, they just sang when they thought it was right, and could join with other people. So I have been exploring this. I often say it's John Cage meets liturgy.
But do you actually, Jude, do you actually sound together at the same time?
Yes.
In Sweden here, there's a lot of choir singing, but people can't really sing together. Maybe they haven't used the right platform. Maybe we
don't sing together. There are 2 ways of bringing people together. One is the way the West has chosen, which is a shared pulse. But if you look to the East, it's the drone. So abandon the shared pulse, which the platforms can't take.
Yeah.
And so that's why we use the drone as a way of keeping, a lot of the chants are based on a single chord, so they will fit, or more or less whatever you do. Yeah. But then sometimes people move away from it, and you hear the things coming together and then separating and coming together. But as you say, Mark, it's an atmosphere of complete uncertainty, because you have no idea what the oud player in Palestine will bring in, as compared with the saxophonist in the States who's more used to jazz. So people will bring in whatever style they bring in. And it's really, I always say it's peace from the bottom up, because peace from the top down demands organization. But this says everybody knows how to make peace. And so let them use their own choice to make peace, and so on. So that, I mean, I don't know what you're going to do tonight, and I can't do all night, but I should do some of it. But I'd be very interested.
Or early in the morning, maybe. Early in the morning. My time, I'm 1 hour ahead of you, so I'll be pretty tired around 7 o'clock.
I'm sorry,
Yeah.
just going to leap in to say that we should wrap it up now.
Yeah.
Looking forward to coming in myself for a little bit this evening.
So I hope also we can have a time to chat during,
yes,
in between.
Indeed.
Yeah, very good.
So thank you all very much
Thank you.
indeed, including Helen, who I think is there with us in the background as well. It's been a wonderfully rich session. As you could probably tell from some of my questions, my background is musical as well. So it's been wonderful for me, and thank you all very much. And we'll see you again during the rest of the event. Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.